We would like to say good evening to everyone. I'm Willie Holton Halbert, your moderator for this evening for our Juneteenth celebration. Well, Bloomington Normal, I tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places where there ain't been no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, eyes have been climbing on and reaching highlands and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So Bloomington Normal, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps cause you find it kind of hard. Don't you fall now. Eyes been going, honey, and eyes are climbing, and life for me ain't been no crystal stair. I'm sure you've recognized this famous poem by Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. I took the liberty of replacing Son with Bloomington Normal. Welcome. The City of Bloomington Human Relations Commission, in partnership with McLean County Historical Society and the Bloomington Normal Black History Project, welcome you this evening to our 2021 annual Juneteenth celebration. Our theme, Justice Delayed. Our goal is to educate, motivate, and celebrate, to explore the history of African Americans and their contributions. We know that Juneteenth is the oldest known celebration commemorating the ending of slavery in the United States. And this week, Juneteenth is now recognized as a national holiday signed into law by a president and even in the state of Illinois by a governor. History has been made, but it's not over. We want to take this time to also acknowledge the proclamations that we have received from the Illinois Senate, the town of Normal, and the city of Bloomington. Also, we want to recognize any officials that are present right now. If you're here, if you can wave your hand, and we would like to recognize you and thank you for being here. We also want to acknowledge our general sponsors. Without them, it would be difficult for us to even have our program. So thank you to Mom Demand Action, Dreams Are Possible, Cooking with Love by Willie Holton Halbert, yours truly, Not in Our Town, and Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. Then we have our exclusive sponsors, the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Bloomington Public Library, Fearless Transformation Center, and Bloomington Normal NAACP. We also have the YWCA of McLean County. We also receive in-kind donations from the YWCA, Peacher's Popcorn that are very tasty, by the way, Town of Normal, Children's Museum, Meta Meck and Baker, and Francis Maddox. To them and to all of our sponsors, we say thank you. And just to kind of go over some protocols for this evening so we are all on the same page. We want you all to know that we are recording this virtual program so we can have it available for others later. Also, we ask participants to remain muted until they are scheduled to speak. And in reality, we will have their questions being answered by, or being asked by Tony. So we ask everyone, please, to make sure that you keep your phones, your computers, your laptops muted. We ask you to use the chat box feature to put your questions and your comments. Don't hesitate. We want to hear from you. If you have a question that you would like to ask our presenter, please feel free to put it into our chat area. Our Zoom administrator, Tony Jones, will share your questions after the presenter is done presenting. During our celebration this week, we have been taking you on a journey. Monday, it was noted that African-American lives did not start with slavery, but with freedom, and that all humanity, based on science, began in Africa. Tuesday continued with looking at various contradictions that exist, that the enslaved are not just objects or property, but in fact, their lives matter. Detailed information on emancipation, and on Wednesday, discussion of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. Last night, we reviewed the Jim Crow as we looked at the various ways we demand our freedom. Discussion on how some choices and how some chose accommodation, versus resistance, looking at the various strategies from Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others. If you happen to miss any of these presentations, they will be available after June 19, and we will post them, all the recordings from each day, on our website at Bloomington Normal Black History Project at bnbhp.com. Our topic for tonight is voter suppression, being presented by Dr. Lane Crothers, a professor of politics and government at Illinois State University, where he has been since 1994. His work focuses on the ways, the values, ideals, and social practices of American politics. Culture shape the way Americans interact both with their own political system and with political systems around the world. He has explored these interests and the author or co-author of more than 20 journal articles and 9 books. Join me as we like to present to you and introduce to other Dr. Lane Crothers. It's all yours.
All right, thank you very much. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here, although as we mentioned in the period we had chatting before this, it's unfortunate we even have to be here and having this conversation, but you know, that's where we are, unfortunately, in this community or in this situation. I'm trying to figure out how to get this out of the way. Nope, that's not what I want to do. All right, we'll do that. Okay. So anyway, I do appreciate, as I say, the opportunity of being here, and I'm looking forward to both presenting some thoughts, presenting some big picture ideas, and then also hopefully engaging with any kind of questions or concerns that you might have. And while on the face of it, there we go. Well, while on the face of it, the question of voter suppression, why it matters, might seem somewhat obvious. I actually thought that I'd at least throw out a couple of ideas for our conversation. Just as a political scientist, we like to think about these things in a big picture sort of way to kind of frame the later discussion. And I want to suggest at least 2 dimensions, only one of which draws very much attention. So, all right, the first of these is going to be, you know, this question of voting suppression, it is intimately tied to the very concept or consequence of democracy itself, right? Democracy implies that there's one standard rule, one standard treatment for all citizens of the community, and therefore that the opportunity to vote is in fact a statement about the moral status of a person within a political community. The denial of that opportunity to vote is also a statement about the moral status of that person as a community. So the right to vote is not just central to democracy in random ways. It's inherently about the moral context. It's also about power. Right? So we are also talking about the question of who votes, how that shapes how the society works, how that shapes the goods and the way goods and power are distributed within a community. I think too often we only think about this in terms of its power dimension. We have failed to allow certain people to vote, or we are trying to deny people the right to vote because of the power dimension. I think that obviously that's extremely important. We also, however, ought to take in fact that we are making moral statements about who counts in a given community. And so this question of voter suppression is deeply, intimately tied to the democratic prospect as such. Also adding a little bit of big picture context to this, I think it's important to remember that voter suppression is incredibly common, not just in the United States, but globally. Voter suppression is a classic technique of power and dominance in society, and it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. So some of you may or may not have heard of English rotten boroughs. In England, as England was slowly democratizing, they would draw district lines in a way that they would allow a landowner to vote if he was the only eligible voter in that district, and a town next door over that had 5,000 people in it would be excluded from voting at all. right? So that this was an attempt to control or protect the power structure. We've had property qualifications, gerrymandering, which we'll talk more about as the term goes on, gender restrictions. It's only been 101 years since we allowed women the right to vote in this society, right? And just as a little sidebar here, right, we've discriminated against gay people and a bunch of other people on grounds. In fact, as late as 1960, this isn't about voting, but as late as 1960, the state of Connecticut denied gay people the right to vote, or sorry, the right to get a driver's license. So this level of discrimination is not new. And it's not new because it's rational. Voter suppression is at least politically rational, right? It simply makes political sense to limit the eligible electorate to favor your partisan point of view, right? The degree to which you can change the political system or warp the political system to benefit your side is always tempting. We are rational beings who use reason for political advantage. And we have inherited hundreds of years of tools and stratagems and techniques that we can continue to apply to express this rational desire. And as our new social media environment emerges and our new technologies with computer and data analysis emerge, we are in fact having a whole new array of technologies to advance voter discrimination and voter suppression in new ways that no one's ever thought about before. The problem with voter suppression is that we're really smart and we're really clever. And we're really good at using that smartness and cleverness in what is fundamentally an abusive and anti-democratic cause. So when we think about voter suppression, when we think about what voter suppression is, we usually think about rules. We think about rules that have restricted voting rights. And as I'm sure you talked about in your presentation, we often think about these in Jim Crow terms, right? We think about poll taxes. We think about grandfather clauses. We think about literacy tests. We think about racial gerrymandering, where I very carefully draw districts in ways that guarantee that are going to make sure that there's no possibility of minority representation. You may or may not be familiar, I don't know if it's come up, but until 1944 in the United States, the Democratic Party in the South declared itself a club, and as a club, it didn't allow African Americans to participate in voting in primaries, right? And so, but of course, in the South, if you won the Democratic primary, you then went on to win the general election. So in fact, winning the primary was the election. This is one of Thurgood Marshall's great cases, Smith versus Allwright. So we often think about it in these terms. I think it's worth pointing out that in American society, the discrimination is extensive. I don't want to say it's much more than just race, because what's much more than just race, but it's very extensive, right? As I mentioned before, right, we historically excluded women from voting. We've historically excluded and resisted immigrants from being integrated fully into our society. The Know Nothing Party of the 1840s and 1850s hated Catholics, right? Particularly from Ireland and Germany, hated Catholics because they were going to destroy real America. We excluded Chinese immigration and a number of other areas. So this is a pervasive, historically embedded, pernicious fact about American political life. And as we'll talk about later, addressing it is also going to require an enormous amount of effort. By the way, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this before. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I just thought when we talk about literacy tests, I like to do this for my students because literacy tests, oh, wow, it just learned to read. What's the problem, right? It's no big deal. I don't know if you've ever seen an actual literacy test before. And if you have, I apologize for the repetitiveness, but this always blows my students away, right? So these were tests, and this is a real test. You can find this online. Given to anyone who couldn't prove they had a 5th grade education. One wrong answer on the test denoted that you failed. You had 10 minutes to complete a 30-minute test. Well, what's on this test that's like this? Well, right, unfortunately, my thing is obscuring me here, so let me get this over here. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. Think about that for a second. How do you draw a line around the number or letter of a sentence? Print a word that looks the same, whether it is printed frontwards or backwards. Again, people with less than a 5th grade education. Write right from the left to the right as you see it spelled here. Now, in fact, all they're asking you to do, if you read that carefully, is write the word R-I-G-H-T, R-I-G-H-T. That's all they're asking you to do, right? But as a practical matter, It's pretty complicated. Divide a vertical line in two equal parts by bisecting it with a curved, fifth grade education, by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that is only straight at its spot bisection of the vertical. To which I ask you, can you draw a curved line? Is it actually possible to draw a curved line? Write every other word in this first line and print every third word in the same line, original type smaller and first line ended at comma, but capitalize the fifth word that you write. One mistake, you fail. The reason I went into this in any kind of detail here is simply to emphasize that when we're talking about rules, they're not just like the straight up rules you can't register. It's the complex system of interpretations, applications that work on multiple levels to achieve the effect of voter suppression. When you look at it, you have to look at more than just the kind of obvious hit you in the face rules. I also think it's important to remember that historically that voter suppression is not just about the rules. It's also building a culture which is structurally discriminatory against the opportunity for people to participate in the system. So creating social norms and values that reduce the chances for meaningful political participation in the community, right? Building a system that makes it hard for certain people to participate, and that hard participation crosses generations and builds over time. So we're talking about things like economic dependency. Back in the day, you would have called it sharecropping, lack of educational and professional opportunities. For long, just as a throwaway, for a long time in a lot of states in the United States, if you were a professional African-American citizen, they weren't going to educate you in the law school or in the medical school in their state. So therefore, you weren't going to have the opportunity to build those networks and build those resources. And without those networks and without those resources, it's hard to challenge complex and sophisticated political systems. Questions of cultural status, the racial encoding of good and evil. I always blow my students away with this. I say, what color do you want? What color do we say things when things are bad? Well, they're black. What color is pureness, happiness, goodness? Why, that's white. Well, what do you know? How did that happen? Right? That you're encoding these standards of citizenship. You're encoding these assumptions about what normal is. In fact, I right before the 2020 election, I think it was the New York Post ran an analysis or an article focusing on the Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the headline was that she is disliked by everybody who isn't Black, Latino, or female. Well, guys, that's like 70% of America. So she's popular, right? But the very framing of it as if white male is normal is a deeply embedded kind of cultural norm there. And of course, you're also talking about the use of violence to compel or control transgressions against economic and cultural order, right? So we're talking, in this case, I would argue we're talking in part about things like the first KKK, which was 1867, the second KKK, which reemerged in the early 1900s, in part because of immigration. You're talking about, of course, Tulsa has recently come up for understandable reasons, the Wilmington coup of 1898, where the white citizens of Wilmington essentially purged what was in fact a Black administration in that city. Over time, of course, what does that do? It collectively creates conditions where people don't even challenge, right? It creates conditions where you don't have to enforce the rules, or at least the formal rules, because nobody ever bothers to challenge because the culture has been created in a particular kind of way. So when we talk about voter suppression today, there's lots of different things to focus on, lots of different issues to engage in. Focusing on the question of rules, there's a lot of them, and they're metastasizing every day, as we all know. Notably, when you follow the discourse, when you talk about the issues, they're almost always presented as these are just neutral. They're just about preventing corruption. They're commonsensical. But it turns out they have profound impact on the way voting works in America. Voter ID is the first obvious one. Why shouldn't you have to show your ID when you're supposed to vote? It's perfectly commonsensical. What the courts have generally ruled, and what most people who study the question of voter identification point out, is that whatever the kind of transparent face level rationality of voter ID is, it's often profoundly discriminatory in effect, and in some ways that aren't necessarily immediately obvious. So, for example, many women in the United States, if they get married, many of them change their names. If they change your name, what happens? Well, then you're going to have to change your voter registration, right? Because you registered under one name, you've gotten married under another name. Well, what does that entail? That requires getting your marriage license. It entails going to the right place. It requires time and investment and effort and understanding that that's what you have to do, as opposed to just showing up at the voting place and voting, because this is where you've always voted and everybody knows you. There's a famous voter ID case from North Carolina, my home state, of a couple of years ago. North Carolina passed a voter ID law, and it accepted 10 forms of ID as recognizable forms of ID for the voter ID in North Carolina, but it specifically excluded forms more likely to be used by Black citizens. In fact, when they got the transcripts, we'll talk about this in a second, but when they got the transcripts about the committee hearings where they were building this law, the Republicans who ran the House literally sent the staff out to go look into the question of what IDs are more commonly used by white people and what IDs are more commonly used by Black people. And they specifically included the ones used by white people, and they specifically excluded the ones used by Black people. In fact, when it finally did go through the appeals court called the law specifically targeted African Americans with surgical precision. Right? So it may sound face level as non-discriminatory, but in fact, in practice, it usually is. We have, of course, increasingly things like restrictions on early voting, mail voting, drop boxes. In general, this tends to discriminate against voters with the least flexibility, with the least time. And of course, it also focuses on the economically and physically vulnerable. Because of the way healthcare and other issues work in the society, many such people, by no means all of them, happen to be Black. And other minorities. It's not only that, it's also poor people, others who the concerns are, or the expectation is, might vote, quote unquote, the wrong way. Increasing levels of restrictions on support for in-person and election day voting, reductions in the number of polling stations, reductions in the ability to vote provisionally, limiting same-day registration. A new twist here, which has been really interesting, is a number of states are passing laws holding poll workers criminally liable for what goes on in their polling station. So if, for example, you're that person standing next to the box where you turn in your little form and you walk away from that box for 2 minutes, there are now, I think it was Georgia, it may have been Georgia, the Georgia law makes you $20,000 criminally liable for that action of walking away and not guarding your station. What's going to happen under those conditions? You're going to get a lot less poll workers. You get a lot less poll workers, you have to close polling stations. I don't know, where are they going to close those polling stations? Right? They're not going to close them in the middle class white places. And they're going to say, oh, no, we put them in the places where voting tends to be higher. But of course, that itself rests on a legacy of historical discrimination. Voter roll purges, this has been a common tactic for the last 10 or 15 years. States quite often hire private firms to go through voting rolls and decide that they should start purging the registration lists. And the argument is, of course, that if you don't purge the registration list, you've got people who've died, you've got others who are voting when they shouldn't be allowed to. But of course, it turns out, in effect, that those firms almost always concentrate on registrations in certain neighborhoods. They almost always concentrate on people whose last names read as not white people's names. And let me be very careful. I'm putting that in big air quotes. I know no one can see that, but I am putting it in big air quotes. But you know what I mean. And so the real intent seems to be, and the information they use is just, if you read about this, it's amazing the information they use. Like, somebody sent a piece of mail to a given address and it came back. Mail comes back sometimes, right? Stuff happens. Or somebody talked about how her apartment building happened to have a FedEx. She was in New York and she happened to have a FedEx on the ground level of her apartment building. And so the people declared that couldn't be a residential building. and so started to wipe all the names off of that. So voter roll purges have tended to be discriminatory in effect. Felony disenfranchisement, of course, has drawn a lot of attention, has a number of different effects. Of course, the disproportional way law enforcement and incarceration works in the United States, this has tended to wildly disproportionately affect African Americans. Among other things, it redistributes populations to the benefit of areas with prisons. That means rural areas, by the way. And it changes the it changes the demographics of the voter population. So rural areas in the United States often have more people in them than they ought to have in them in terms of representation purposes, because they count the prisoners who were transferred to those rural areas as part of the local population. Also then depopulates the areas where they may have been arrested. And it has profound effects on the way the society works. Kentucky is the single worst state in the United States for felony disenfranchisement, and obviously not a leading light of progressive incarceration. And 25% of African Americans in the state of Kentucky are currently disenfranchised. It's 25%. Florida has passed the restoration of voting rights by referendum. They did that in the 2020 election, but they did it. But the governor and the legislature now have put so many restrictions in place for released felons from released prisoners to get their voting rights back that it's become effectively impossible. Again, bending the electorate dramatically. Shelby versus Holder has to do with the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, the Supreme Court ruled on Shelby versus Holder that something called pre-clearance no longer mattered. Pre-clearance is a rule that in the southern states that had historically been discriminatory in their practices. If they wanted to change something in their voting rules, they had to get clearance from the Department of Justice to guarantee that those changes weren't discriminatory. They ended that, and discrimination or racial gerrymandering has resurged. This is why the redistricting that's happening this cycle really matters. And I can show it to you in dramatic effect. If you know Dan Crenshaw, he's the congressman from Texas, former Navy SEAL, wounded in Afghanistan, rising star of the Republican conservative establishment. That's his district, right? That's suburban Houston. Tell me that's not drawn in a way that guarantees that he's safe as can be and could be as conservative as he wants to be, right? So this is all part of this broad pattern. I also think we ought to at least talk, and I'll be done soon, but talk a little bit about some of the cultural elements that are feeding this environment, feeding this context of voter suppression. So we have built a society, and social media by all means is certainly enhanced to this, where the denigration of groups by race, ethnicity, immigration, sexual identity status has become normalized, right? So in other words, we've increasingly created a dynamic, and certainly Trumpism was a lot of this, of real Americans versus them. And real Americans are the ones who vote the right way, right? The overt threats or use of violence when elections don't go the right way, the January 6th insurrection being the most obvious case, but more broadly, voter intimidation, poll watcher training. There's a lot of laws being passed right now that are saying that are going to allow poll watchers to carry guns in the polling places. That's staggering in terms of what that does and the challenges that may bring to the electoral process. The delegitimation of elections through claims of corruption, demand for perpetual audits, the refusal to certify contrary results. If you do not accept the results of an election as valid, democracy is done. It's done, right? There's no point. If I have to win or nothing, then you're a 3-year-old, but you're a 3-year-old with the power of the state. And that's a much more dangerous thing. The culture of demobilization and cynicism, I actually believe the last 40 years as we've kind of engaged in this systematic assault on the state, the systematic assault on government. Basically, we've been trying to teach people that government can't succeed, so why bother? Which works really well for the powerful and influential who are already on top. And it works less well for the ordinary, for people who need help. And there is the culture of distraction as well, right? Politics is hard. It's often boring. Entertainment is easy, accessible, fun, light. These are all problems we're facing on this question of voter suppression. So a few concluding thoughts. The rules matter, and we ought to focus a lot on the rules and understand the rules, but they interact with culture. So that the cultural context in which those rules operate also matter and need to be paid attention to. It is a sad fact of our political reality that it is easier to destroy than it is to build, and it's easier to mobilize with fear than it is to mobilize with solidarity. The fight about voter rights and the fight about voter suppression is unbalanced, and it's unbalanced in favor of the people who are peddling fear. I wish it wasn't, but it is. The forces of voter suppression will use whatever they can to get as much as they can. It's an entirely cynical operation. It is an entirely nakedly political operation. And the more they win, the easier winning gets, because the more you suppress and the more you repress and the fewer people you let vote, the easier it is to guarantee that your people win. Now, potentially that builds to a much more painful and negative long-term path, right? Potentially that builds to a more insurrectionary, violent path that none of us want to. But nonetheless, it's one of the ironic side effects. When you're going to try to challenge voter suppression, in other words, you have to move forward on multiple fronts. You have to fight the rules, you have to fight the challenge to prevent the rules from being written, but you also have to build a culture in which participation and engagement is normal, in which it's ordinary, in which it's hopeful, and only then are you likely to be successful, right? Unless you need both the rules and the culture to work to make the possibility of voter suppression or a better tomorrow possible. That was very circuitous. I didn't say that very well, but you know what I mean. So I'll finish with the point that I make to all my American government classes every semester. Whether or not they like it, this is how I end it. I pop up this guy's picture. Hopefully you recognize him, Ben Franklin. What everyone thinks about the framers, and there's lots of complex things to think about the framers, and I certainly respect that. The point of this story is that at the end of the Constitutional Convention in September of 1787, they were done drafting the document. They walked out of what today we call Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and someone in the crowd called out, "Well, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" And very famously, his response was, a republic, if you can keep it. And what I try to remind my students every semester is that none of this happens automatically. It doesn't happen, there's no them who comes and saves us, right? The Avengers don't just show up and make the world all safe for tomorrow. We either keep the republic or we lose it. And every other experiment in the history of humanity where a wildly diverse range of people from wildly different backgrounds and ideas have tried to govern themselves successfully, every single prior example has failed. It's all failed. So it's fundamentally up to us as to whether or not we can make this work and whether or not we can keep it. And fighting the fight about voter suppression, it seems to me, is absolutely one of the pieces that's going to make that possible. And with that, I can only say thank you, and I'll be happy to take whatever questions anyone has.
Tony, if you can look at the chat to see if we have any questions.
And I'll stop sharing. There we go.
At the present time, we do not have questions.
Uh-oh, I'm that good. I've explained it all.
I have one.
Okay.
I'm not in the chat, but Dr. Crothers, how can we build a culture of participation and engagement when it's easier to destroy than it is to build?
You know, I knew I was going to get asked that question when I brought that point up, and I don't have any great answers either. What I will say is this, and I've been struck by this because I've now been in higher education, well, as a student or a faculty person now for, 35 years. And one of the things that's really struck me is the degree to which for almost all of that period of time, all we've heard about is the phrase that Ronald Reagan used in one of his speeches, I believe in his inaugural address, was the 9 scariest words in the English language are I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And for 40 years now, we have heard the market can do it better, government is corrupt and lazy, let's just cut income taxes and suddenly you'll get the beautiful trickle down thing. I think it's part, the first thing is to recapture the notion that we are the government. That if it's not doing what we want it to, then we need to argue that it needs to, and you need to organize for that purpose. One of the things that I run into, particularly with my students, is what has sometimes been referred to as slacktivism. And slacktivism means you do things like hit like on a Twitter or a Facebook page, and then you think you've done something. At the end, there's a great documentary from the 1992 presidential campaign called The War Room, and it's about the Bill Clinton election. And at the end of it, James Carville, the political commentator most of us are probably familiar with, is talking to the staff, and he said, the most precious thing anyone can give is time, right? Time is much harder to give than money. And so it's one thing at a time. It's joining the group. It's engaging. It's going and working for a member of the state legislature. It's sending the letter, the email, whatever else. It's trying to link action to outcome, and to do it in small ways. It's not winning the presidency that matters. It's winning the local office that then elects the county office that then wins the state office. And that's accessible. That we can do. You're not ever going to meet Joe Biden. I met Barack Obama when he was running for the Senate in 2004, but he hasn't called me since. You know what I mean? But you can do the local stuff. And that seems to me to be, if we could get people engaged on that, that's at least a good starting place. It's also where we live, of course, so that makes a difference.
So how do you get more Stacey Abrams in the world to make a difference?
Well, I think you become Stacey Abrams. I mean, and that's easy to say, right? But how did she start? And I don't know her biography well enough to give you here, right? But my guess is she read well, she got a good degree, and then she started volunteering. One of the things, I tell this story to my classes as well. One of our former students, in that, I don't think it was the same event that I was at that I met Barack Obama, but at a nearby one, he literally walked up to Barack Obama at the end of that event and said, "Wow, that was great. I'm really impressed. Can I help you out in any way?" And I'm sure he just figured that he'd be, handed a card or something and call that guy. And Obama said, "I'm tired. Drive me to my next gig." And he spent the next 2 weeks driving around with Barack Obama, taking him places. And he ended up co-chairing the Oregon campaign for Obama, right? It's the actual going and meeting and engaging and learning the tricks and the ropes, right? Politics is a skill. It's learning how to be yelled at without going insane. And we all learn, all of us want to go insane. We all have tempers, but they learn how to do it, right? And as you develop those skills, you discover that those skills have knock-on effects. And maybe they have them in politics, and maybe they have them in business, and maybe they just have them in your private life. But thinking about it as an empowerment model, and how do I build the skills I need to rise up to whatever excites me, then she got excited about something. She got pissed about something, right? I mean, she got pissed, and she built her passion, and giving people the freedom to do that and say, what drives you? Go do that. One time I heard a discussion of a nerd that what a nerd was somebody who really loved doing what they were doing, right? Well, that's cool. We need more of those people. Right, we need the people who are willing to throw themselves into that, and then in the social media era, it's very easy to knock them down, and it's very easy to make fun of them, and it's very easy to do all these other things. But in fact, we need to sit there and say, "God bless you, go." Mm-hmm. And we don't do enough of that, I don't think.
Tony, did we get some other questions in the chat?
Yes, we did get another question. The first question is, Are you current on legislation here in Illinois that address suppression? And the second part of that, in legislation proposed to allow undocumented immigrants to vote in school board elections only.
Right. There's a lot of different rumors about a lot of different things. There are, to my knowledge, I'm not personally aware of either one of those. I know there is a lot of chatter about the proposed federal legislation about voting. One of the kind of the Fox News talking points is it's suddenly going to allow lots of illegal immigrants, or I should say undocumented immigrants, we put it that way, the opportunity to vote. All such claims, to my knowledge, are false. Right? They're the kind of thing that gets exercised and gets engaged. Illinois, to its several levels here. Illinois, to its credit, is one of the best states in the United States today on voter registration laws and on access to voting. And I can tell you, in McLean County, there's a lot of research into the question of what's the most effective type of ballot for ballot security purposes. And the fill in your oval ballot and shove it into a machine is the single best way to vote. You should not vote on the stupid machines. You should vote on the little paper ballot things you shove into the machine. Although if you vote early, you don't have a lot of choice. But and we do that here, right? So we actually are absolutely state of the art on those issues. Is that going to be guaranteed to be true everywhere in the state of Illinois? No, but Illinois as a rule is absolutely at the positive edge of those things. And more than that, even ballot access issues. New York, which is good in a lot of ways, ballot access is terrible. It's incredibly partisan, dominated by pretty corrupt Democrats. New York is terrible. Illinois is actually pretty admirable in the way we do it. So I don't see any reason to presume with the Democratic legislature and the Democratic governor that's going to change anytime soon.
Okay, we have a second question from Jeff. Any new laws forthcoming legislation on felony disenfranchisement?
That's a great question. That's one of those things that lots of leaders like to say they're in favor of right up until they're close enough to the election where it might actually matter. So states like there are states that are more progressive than Illinois in that matter. In Maine, you can actually vote if you are being held but not yet been convicted. That's not the case in most states in the United States. Illinois on felony disenfranchisement has made it easier over time to restore voting rights. In Illinois, to my knowledge, you get them back as soon as you finished your parole and other kinds of commitments. Part of the issue in Florida has been that what the governor has decided to do is to interpret or to set a series of barriers that once you finish your incarceration, once you've finished all your commitments, he then, for example, is going to demand every additional thing, like every court cost you ever faced, upfront. Well, if you've just spent 25 years in prison, I don't care where you're from. You probably don't have 50,000 spare dollars to throw at court costs to get your voting rights back. So Illinois, again, is already pretty good. There's probably better they could do. I have seen some legislation recently, but I don't think any action's been taken on it.
Okay. We have a question that came in. It's rather lengthy. So Sarah Breeden, I'm going to ask you to paraphrase or state your question.
Sure, I just copied it from the Illinois General Assembly page, and it is it's the one that I asked about the immigrants that are not citizens, but being able to vote in school board elections. It is actually legislation that has been introduced. It's SB 1565. And so that's just the synopsis that's from the Illinois General Assembly page.
Sure, I was not familiar specifically with that. The prospects of that being passed, it seems to me, are beyond zero. Right, you have to get through the entire Senate, the entire House. You can only imagine what the what the public hue and cry would be. I don't even know who it matters. I would suggest it matters who introduced it. So if it was introduced by a Republican, it was almost certainly introduced with the intent of forcing an uncomfortable vote. If it was introduced by a Democrat, that would be interesting to know what the logic and argument was, but I don't think there's any meaningful prospect of that moving forward.
It's Selena Villanueva. She's a Democrat.
Okay, yes. Well, I can see the argument, but I still don't even begin to perceive of a chance of that moving forward. Because if you are a Democrat in a whole lot of other parts of the state of Illinois, you're saying to yourself, do I really want to run for reelection with that being charged at me? I mean, whatever the merits might be, it's really hard to imagine it being sold politically or the governor getting on board with it.
And then the other one that I asked about was the, and I don't have it handy, but there were several items with regard to improving our voting here. As you said, ours is, with regard to voter suppression, ours is better than many other states, especially those states that are introducing additional voter suppression laws. But I feel like I remember reading that we were going to now have the option of permanent mail-in voting, whereas now you have to request the ballot at each election, and that there were going to be polling places in jails now and some other things. So I don't have those handy, but I'm the one that asked about that. So I feel like that recently did pass. I don't know if the governor signed it yet.
And I don't know off the top of my head either. I can only say, in general, Illinois is on the advanced edge or leading edge of that, but how far out we are, I couldn't tell you. I'm not gonna lie to you and act like I can, because I can't.
Okay, we have an additional question from Jeff. Early voting, will it become the norm in post-pandemic?
Yeah, great question, and I think it absolutely completely depends on where you live. We have, barring a federal law, which right now at least seems unlikely, it seems to be entirely a matter of where you live. So things like Illinois, I think we're encouraging early voting. We're making it easy to early vote. We're making it more accessible to early vote, at least relatively. In a lot of states like Texas, Georgia, and elsewhere, they're doing everything in their power to reduce it. And they're trying to, whether it's reducing hours, reducing polling places. Dodge City, Kansas, in the 2016 cycle, which happens to be a city that has a large Hispanic population, they actually put their early voting polling station a mile outside of the city limits of town and a mile past the last bus stop. Right? So the idea where they're making it very clear that it's easy to do it if you have a car and a heck of a lot less easy to do it if you need public transportation. And it's interesting, my mother still lives in North Carolina, and when the state of North Carolina reduced its early voting hours, she got mad. And my mother's a nice moderate Democrat lady, but I'm just saying, she was like, I like to be able to schedule it on my schedule. I like to be able to do it on my thing. But all the states that are trying to discourage voting right now are absolutely trying to reduce the early voting hours, because they're trying to keep economically vulnerable, physically vulnerable people away from the polls to the greatest extent, on the presumption, fair or not, that they are probably likely to vote Democrat. And that's also why, again, the souls to the polls suppression, the other kinds of things they're doing, right, are on the presumption that the people who would benefit from those things are probably going to vote not Republican.